Welcome to the recorded version of Solving Communication Issues Within Families, part of the Family Caregiver Support webinar series brought to you by the American Society on Aging and a generous sponsorship from Home Instead Senior Care.
All right, our presenter today is Molly Carpenter. Author, speaker, trainer, and family caregiver, Molly Carpenter brings years of personal and professional senior care experience and training to families dealing with dementia care. In her current role, Molly works with a team responsible for ensuring that the Home Instead Senior Care Network's 60,000 caregivers worldwide have the resources necessary to effectively provide quality care in the home and understand the importance of their work enhancing the lives of those they serve. Molly holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Family Science with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a master's degree in education with a gerontology specialization from the University of Nebraska-Omaha. And with that, I would like to turn the floor over to our presenter, Molly Carpenter. Thank you again for joining us today, Molly.
Thank you, Steve, for such a lovely, warm welcome. And hello, everybody out there. Happy holidays. I hope you're all doing well. I echo Steve's comments. I hope your weather's well and doing good. Our weather here in Nebraska is pretty nice. It's actually 45 degrees today, so we're going to take it. So thank you all so much for joining us again today on our last webinar of 2014. And boy, is it a good topic today. We're going to talk about family dynamics, more specifically sibling dynamics. You know, these webinars every year or every month are about how to support the family. And I think usually every one, we talk a little bit about how families are coping and dealing with each other. But this one is really just about those family dynamics and how a lot of you, I know for a fact that many of you are in the middle of these family relationships and in the middle of these sibling dynamics. And I've been in the same boat many, many times. So this topic is hopefully going to give you some tips on how to help families and siblings and help you, hopefully, you stay out of the middle a little bit more. So the objectives are up there. Let's look at those objectives, more specifically what we're going to cover. We're going to start with knowing the hot buttons or the red flags, so to speak, that will come up between families. And I want you to be aware of those so that you can maybe avoid them or you can be prepared when one of these touchy subjects come up. So it's going to be a good one. We're also going to look and talk about lots of tips today and even a checklist to really help siblings through this caregiving journey. Sometimes when there's something tangible in place, like a checklist or some steps that a family can take, that goes a long way with helping them resolve some issues and getting through this caregiving journey. And as always, we will discuss resources that can help overcome and help siblings through these issues. We like to give you lots of resources every time so that you've got something to pass on to families as well. So let's get started on the next slide. And I want to start talking about why there's sibling conflict in these caregiving situations. And as we kind of go through this today, think about your own family and your siblings, and think about how a caregiving situation would impact that relationship or your relationships. Now, if you don't have siblings, think of an example, maybe a family that you've already worked with. I want you to kind of have a visual today when we're thinking about this topic and sort of putting yourself in that position as being a person caring for somebody with siblings. Now, we all know sharing isn't always easy for us siblings with our brothers and sisters. And many of you remember that when you were growing up, the challenge of even dividing up your toys or who gets the bigger bedroom or who gets to take the car out tonight, you know, all common issues that brothers and sisters may disagree over, fight over. And even sharing household chores when we were younger, you know, they led to lots of family conflicts. And, of course, some things never change. And according to the research that Home Instead Senior Care has conducted, sharing the care of elderly parents can be a source of conflict for adult siblings. So it's a much serious issue, but there's still sibling conflict. The research found that 43% of U.S. families, one sibling has the responsibility for providing the most care, and in only 2% of families did the siblings split the caregiving responsibility. So think about that. 43% of U.S. families, one sibling's doing most of the work, and only 2% actually had a division of labor where everybody was sort of helping. That's a very, very low number. That might shed some light into this discussion today and all of you in your daily work of why there's so many sibling conflicts now. We all know how busy people's lives are, and it's hard to stay in touch, even when you live in the same community. And not having that regular communication with siblings and with brothers and sisters, they can lead to miscommunication, they can lead to hard feelings, and it makes it even harder to have those candid discussions about what's happening with mom and dad and with aging parents. Now, according to Dr. Ingrid Condidus, I'm sorry, guys, I'm really having trouble with her name, a sibling relationship expert. She's from the University of Western Ontario. Caregiving can either bring families together or can cause trouble. And in some cases, it can do both. These issues are very emotional. Now, this is from a researcher who this is all she studies. So, again, it's a topic that's researched and looked into to quite some extent. Now, there's some additional statistics on the next slide that I want you all to look at. Some additional interesting research provides great insight into these issues that siblings face and as they try to provide the best care for their aging parents. And this research can give you guys more insight into the family's issues that are faced with these senior clients and with their adult children. So first of all, just to give you some context, this is a survey. These slides, we're going to go over these stats. Those are results from a survey of 700 or so adults in the U.S. and almost 400 adults in Canada. And they were aged 35 to 64. And this research project was conducted for Home Instead by the Boomer Project, which is one of the leading authorities in information and insight about the boomer consumer and the fast-growing 50-plus age market. So little information about the Boomer Project. It's important to note what they primarily only study the boomer age group. So they did the study, and the respondents in the study have siblings or step-siblings, and they're currently providing care for a parent or an older relative, or they had provided care for the past 18 months. So just some context on the survey. So here's what the research showed, as you can see on the slide. 46% of caregivers say that their sibling relationships have deteriorated and that their brothers and sisters are unwilling to help. That's almost half. 42% of family caregivers give themselves and their siblings a below-average grade for their ability to divide the caregiving workload. Now think about this one for just a minute. Both the caregiver that's doing the caregiving and the other caregivers that maybe aren't doing all of the caregiving, none of them know how to divide the workload up. I think that's really interesting, and this research was so important because that's something easy that we can help families with, which we'll get to in just a few moments. And I think about examples. This is why I want you to sort of picture your own family in this scenario. I'm thinking about my family as an example here. My mom has one sister, and when they were caring for my grandmother lived 45 miles away from my mom, and my aunt lived in the exact same city. So it was really hard to divide when one sibling lived further. It wasn't as easy as saying, okay, you do the laundry this week when my mom didn't live nearby. So my mom, the approach she took is anything that my aunt asked her to do, she usually did it because she knew my aunt was taking most of the load. And my mom also offered to help a lot so that my aunt wouldn't feel the burden. And so that's how they navigated this care situation in the beginning. And of course, as my grandmother declined, everybody adjusted, and that's another important thing to consider, and we'll talk about this later in the webinar about how you have to adjust the caregiving situation, and siblings have to be ready for that. So there's another stat on that slide that says 64% of the youngest siblings are primary caregivers, compared with 57% of oldest siblings, and 49% are middle siblings. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I guess I would tend to think that the oldest would probably be the most likely person to be the primary caregiver. So that was an interesting insight into this research. There's a couple more data points on the next slide, so let's look at those. Again, this is great context before we go into our discussion. There's another factor that became present throughout this research. Now, there was some additional research that we looked at by Cornell University, and one of the researchers there studies favoritism. And favoritism is alive and well. This researcher conducted one study and found that mothers aged 65 to 75 in the Boston, Massachusetts area, this is where the study took place, were perfectly willing to name favorites among their children. Now, I'm sure you're all picturing your family and your parents would never name favorites, but according to this study, when asked on a confidential study, parents will name their favorites. So that is a factor. It is something. This was just one study that we looked at in addition to the research, but it's just something to consider. And birth order and parental preferences do impact the caregiving situations in families with multiple siblings. So these are important to keep in mind as you work with families who are making decisions for their parents. Firstborns are said to be highly responsible and commanding leaders, while the youngest are supposedly milder and easygoing, more humble. And those types grow into their caregiving adults. The firstborns often feel it's their job to make the decisions, and they also expect that their younger brothers and sisters fall in line behind them. But as we just saw on the other slide, perhaps the firstborn isn't always the caregiver. They are a lot of the time, but not always. The youngest usually had the most. Now, on the other hand, recent research has found that many aging parents have a favorite child whom he or she wants to be their primary caregiver. And actually, when they need caregiving, that's who they want to lean on, is that child, it's either their favorite or it's the one they just want to be that person. And in 2 out of 3 cases, the favorite is the obliging youngest, not the bossy eldest, according to a 2010 study that, again, we found out of that research that from the Boomer Project. So I found that fascinating as we went through this research. The study from Cornell and from Purdue universities in 2013 found that a parent is more likely to become depressed when his or her preference of primary caregiver is not honored. So again, that's a tough situation for a family because the oldest might think that that's their role and that's what they want to do, while the youngest is who the parent wants to have the caregiver. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this today. So what can families do? Let's look on the next slide at one option or one solution, and that is what we were calling the 50-50 rule. Now, again, we partnered with researchers on sibling relationships and family dynamics, and we developed the 50-50 rule program to help siblings deal with the many issues associated with caring for their parents. Now, the 50-50 rule refers to the average age of 50 when siblings are typically starting to or caring for their parents, as well as the need for brothers and sisters to share in the care planning. That's where the other 50 comes from. So if you're working with seniors and adult children around age 50 who are trying to figure out how to share the care, it is a time for them to develop a plan, and that's where this 50-50 rule and the resources around it can help. So we're going to go through this booklet and this resource today. But just know that this is available, and I'll share that at the end, where you can find this information and where you can send siblings to really work this out as well. So there are some issues that can cause sibling conflict, and I want to take a look at those issues on the next slide. We've identified the top 5 hot button issues, so to speak, of what siblings might be dealing with or might cause conflict. It can be stressful being a family caregiver, as we all know, and certain situations are hot button triggers. And I bet you've seen a lot of these as you've been working with families, and I bet they come up frequently. And so let's start running through those, and I'm going to start with illness. Now, a parent who becomes ill or faces declining health can leave a family facing all sorts of potential difficult issues. Who's going to provide the care? How will the care be provided? Those are some of the questions that siblings might be asking. Now, siblings can have different opinions on the type of care their parents should receive. Now, let's think about an example. I bet a number of you have been in a situation where a parent is not thriving and not getting better, and hospice would be a great plan of care for that individual. But one sibling doesn't want that, and the other sibling thinks it's the best option. I know that you've all experienced that. I've had that difficult conversation myself. I've also had the example of where I've had 2 sisters sort of actually fighting right in front of me about, does mom really need assisted living, or does she need a specialized Alzheimer's care? You know, I've just seen it go back and forth and back and forth. And so when there's a major illness or a major disease, there's a lot of issues that can come up. And it's hard because when these come up, they turn to us and into our professions as sort of to provide the tiebreaker or to side with one of them. So this is where it's really important as professionals that we have to stay neutral and we have to stay objective and not take sides. So a lot of you, I know this is something you probably deal with on a regular basis. Also, when you think about illness, illness presents changing needs, and siblings are going to need to be flexible to address those changing health issues. That goes without saying. It's sort of like setting expectations in the beginning when you're encountering families and there's a new illness or a new situation or a decline in health. Just reminding siblings that, you know, this is the situation today. It could be different tomorrow, and I know that's hard, but that's how this is going to be, so that they're used to being flexible and get used to addressing those changing health issues. Another disagreement that can come around this illness or come around the person's condition or capabilities, this is where family members have very different ideas about what is actually wrong with a loved one and what should be done about it. Now, I had a family one time where the daughter was convinced that her mother was no longer capable of driving, while her brother argued that she needed to maintain her independence and keep driving. So that was causing major, major concerns with mom in the middle of it, and of course mom wanting to drive but also not being a little nervous about driving because the daughter was so concerned. So there's a lot of, when you think about illness and about this caregiving situation, those are just a few examples of how complicated it is when it comes to siblings agreeing and siblings being on the same page. And now another hot button issue is finances or money. Of course, this is no surprise, as money matters often complicate life at any stage, let alone when dealing with an aging or ill parent. Siblings can be forced to make tough caregiving decisions when their loved one's finances factor into the equation. And money's tough. It's like I just said, it's tough at any stage, but when somebody's ill, it's another thing to consider. So there's just another complication into the sibling conflict. Another hot button issue is the inheritance, which kind of goes back to money and finances, but some families contend with the lack of funds to provide care. but other families have that temptation or that thought about the inheritance, and that might be influencing their decision making. Now, if siblings are coming from the wrong place, making decisions based on wanting parents to save more or spend more, this can cause conflict. Siblings will need to recognize this highly emotional issue that can easily escalate to a family feud, one where everyone stands to lose. So this is where involving a financial planner that might be impartial, this may be the best bet with some of those money situations. And I know we've talked about money and those important documents, the wills. Again, just to reiterate that point, how important those documents are in this process. They can, just having those documents, those important documents, can really diffuse a lot of situations. And of course, we have to think about the roles and rivalries dating back to childhood that might rear their ugly head during this time and when we're talking about inheritance. Mature adults often find that they're back in the sandbox when their family gets together, and this tendency can grow even more pronounced under the strain of caregiving. So when you think about inheritance, you go back to rivalries and, well, that he was always mom's favorite or so on. So there's just, again, that underlying, it's important for all of us to understand some of that underlying issues as we deal with families. Another hot button issue is distance. Now, siblings who live in the same town or city as their parents may be stuck with most of the caregiving work. And as I mentioned earlier, 43% of the families, that one sibling is responsible for the bulk of the care. So long-distance caregivers can feel left out, or if they do speak up, they can be viewed as, the bossy one or as meddling. If you think about the long-distance caregiver, they might not be in touch as much, and they might want some more information. So when they question the primary caregiver, that can be viewed as negative, when really they may just want some updates. So the primary caregiver may feel that others are not helping and that they're left with all the work. So you can kind of see both sides of that. And I know I shared an example about my family, so just to give some context to think about that is distance is a major hot button and can cause some strain on the sibling relationship. Now, another area of focus is stress on the caregiver. Daily life can be stressful, and family caregiving can make it even more so. Adult caregivers who have started a new job or they're raising their children, they can become overwhelmed when their parent or elderly family members need help. Siblings who are bearing the brunt of the caregiving may resent the brothers and sisters who are unable or unwilling to help, which just leads to more stress. So the burden of care, one person takes on most of the duties. This is a really tough area, and we're going to talk more about that in the next few slides. But on the next slide, I want to talk more about the emotional areas that some of these caregivers might be feeling. And I think it's always important to look at the emotional side. And it's important that siblings not only each have their role, but the primary person or the coordinator must also be appointed. So maybe that's the person who's designated as the power of attorney. And using words like coordinator rather than person in control or primary caregiver can, again, foster an environment of collaboration. And we got to think about this. Each person, every sibling or everybody in the family, they have their own strengths. So giving everyone a role is important, and it helps each person feel that they are a member of the care team. I would encourage families to sit down together and make a plan based on each other's strengths. Now, I've got a great example of a family that I worked with. They had 9 siblings in the family, so 9 people trying to care for mom. Dad was gone. And each one had a role, and I found this extremely fascinating. Now, of course, one of the daughters was the main caregiver, was sort of the primary caregiver, or what did I just say, the coordinator, so to speak. And then there was one sibling who was in charge of paying the bills. There was one sibling in charge of taking Mom to get her hair done each week. And there was even one sibling whose only job was to take Mom out once a week for fun. He had a great personality. This was one of the brothers. So he could get her to laugh at any time. And when it was time for Mom, with his time for his mom that week, they did whatever they wanted to do, whatever Mom wanted to do. The agenda was just to have fun. And so I think about it like when he was traveling for business and couldn't do his weekly visit with Mom or go take her somewhere, you could tell. Mom was different. She was down in the dumps. She missed it. She missed her fun day out, her fun few hours out. And even the rest of the siblings could tell. That's why they never questioned his contribution to the care. I mean, it was the fun job. It was the one who got to go do something fun and not worry about a detail or a task. It was the fun thing to do. But it was so important to their mother. And because as a family, they all decided on each of, and, were okay with everybody's role. There was never any hard feelings with the family. So especially in a family of that size, it's really important to divide up, give everyone a role, and appreciate each other's role, which leads right into another one of those emotional issues of underappreciating. Caregivers can feel underappreciated. This can be where one sibling is doing all the work, carrying the entire load. And when this person is overworked and underappreciated, everyone will suffer. The caregiver themselves will feel tremendous stress and pressure. And when that person is stressed out, the rest of the family will feel it too, including the care recipient, the parent, which is the last thing that we want to happen. So it's important that we help primary caregivers realize that they can't do this alone and give them lots of ways to help them manage their stress. We could even suggest that they call a family meeting and ask for more help from others, and encourage the family to come with solutions. So this is a time when you all can share your resources in the community and really help that primary caregiver manage the situation. So when there's a tone of underappreciation happening in the relationship, it's probably a good time to call a family meeting and talk about new solutions, new ways everybody can help. The other issue, kind of an emotional issue or personality to consider, is the perfectionist. Now, we all know these people. They say things, if I want something done right, I have to do it myself. We all know those people in our life. We have the family caregiver that thinks no one can give better care than them. And our role needs to be aware when we run into somebody like that. And it also needs to be if we can help them understand that, if others don't make the bed the same way you do, at least it's done. And it's okay that it's made differently. So there's just a point where we can really encourage that perfectionist to sort of let go of all those little things. The perfectionist personality is not everyone's personality, thank God. It's like when you ask someone to do you a favor, but they do it wrong. Like you ask your spouse to load the dishwasher and they do it wrong. Well, they're not going to help next time because they don't want to screw it up. So we've got to really help that perfectionist understand that, sometimes it's okay if it's not done the exact way they would do it, but it's at least done, and that's taking a load off that primary caregiver. So there's just some ways to sort of talk that through with the perfectionist themselves or that primary caregiver, if they are a perfectionist, as well as the other siblings, because helping those other siblings, navigate that, it's hard. And you've all seen a lot of those other siblings just throw their hands up and say, okay, obviously I'm not going to help anymore because I'm doing it wrong. I've heard that several times from families. So helping them understand, well, there's a different way to approach it. Try this way, try that way. So there's just it's good to call attention to this type of a caregiver. I know you've all met those caregivers before. So let's start talking about some solutions. And I want to go on the next slide. Let's start looking at the checklist or some ways that we can really help caregivers navigate this. Now, when you think about a checklist, it's just something about a checklist makes people get organized, and it feels impartial, and it's just a way to sort of start figuring out the next steps. And it's a tactical thing that lots of people are used to doing and can do. So we got to start with identifying and list senior needs. So what the aging parent, whatever their needs are, let's just get down on paper what they need. It could be anything medically they need. It could be housing changes. It could be maybe you need to think about, do they have a will and those advance directives? Maybe that's something that needs to be on the list. Are they struggling with eating nutrition meals? Is that a need that's identified? The housekeeping, how are they going to get to doctor's appointments? How are they going to schedule doctor's appointments? Who's paying the bills? All of those different categories. There's so many categories. It's really important to just get the needs listed down on paper. From there, we turn to researching options. So once siblings have identified the types of services or the types of things that their parent will need, they can come up with some interventions or care options. And this is where a lot of you will come in to help. You all know all your community resources so well. You're going to help them discover some of those resources that can meet those needs. It's important then, to sort of have a family meeting again and discuss who is going to handle each of the needs and setting up each service. So it's that step where you're dividing up the task. Everybody has a role, and everybody has input into mom's care, and they have the opportunity to share ideas and solutions. And then planning ahead. When needs and resources are identified, siblings will have a better idea of what's required, and they will know sort of what could be in the future. So a lot of times when we say families have to be prepared for adapting situations and the changes in the person and what that means, by getting the needs down and getting some options down, it automatically helps you think about the future and put some ideas and plan in place for the future when things do change. So, for example, if their parent wants to stay at home and age in place and everything's okay now, you're just going to cook meals once a week for them. Well, in the future, you might need to talk about providing support, maybe hiring a caregiving company to come in and support the person living at home. So it's just some ways by doing a simple checklist to get a family prepared for what's ahead. Now, a checklist is very helpful. I love checklists, but there's also some just general tips that I want us to talk through as well on the next slide that we can provide siblings. And this goes back to when we're all caught in the middle or we're in that family discussion. These are just some things to keep in your back pocket to pull out and suggest to families as they are navigating the care situation. So we start with of course, the importance of talking and listening. Adult siblings should get together in person or by the phone, really listen to each other's questions and concern. They can begin to list the resources that their family will need. Again, that goes back to identifying the senior's needs. And we talked earlier about how important it is for brothers and sisters to stay in regular contact to avoid that miscommunication and hard feelings. So if the primary caregiver isn't reaching out enough, that can lead to an issue. If the siblings aren't checking in with the primary caregiver enough, that could lead to an issue. So got to keep those lines of communication open. And then when you think about listening, a lot of times we want to just go and we want to just do. We don't really want to listen. We just want to do what we think we should do. And this is one of those times where listening will pave the way to success. Everybody needs a chance to be heard. Everybody needs to understand each other's perspectives. So when you do understand where somebody's coming from, when they call and ask a question or they give a suggestion, you know why they're asking or saying those things. So just encouraging families to keep talking and keep listening, which sounds so simple right now on the phone as we're talking about this, but you know how easy it is for siblings to just shut down and say, well, I'm just not going to talk to her. I'm just going to ignore her for a while, wait for her to call back or whatever it is. So you've all experienced this. So just keep that in mind of just stressing the talking and the listening. The other thing that we've talked a lot about is making decisions together. Working together to make decisions will be key to family harmony. We've talked about how seniors' needs change as they age. So do the lives of adult siblings. So that's something else to consider. So when you start off making decisions together, this is going to help in a changing environment, which kind of goes to the next point of being flexible or remaining flexible throughout this time. The parents' needs, their family person, their loved one, their care is going to change, and their needs are going to change, and their assistance, they might need more assistance in the future. And so as families understand this, they can adapt their plan on a regular basis, which again goes back to dividing that workload. We talked a lot about this earlier. It just can't be stressed enough. And it just goes back to promoting sibling teamwork and decision-making. Maybe we say, maybe you offer them to set up a regular time that they talk on the phone. Or maybe there's a family, I've seen this a lot, I bet you guys have seen this, a family email update. And it's an update, and it's whenever it's a string that just keeps going. And you reply all, and you give your information of what happened today or whatever. Even just encouraging a family email will go a long ways. Families can set up, when they've set up their caregiving plan, they can set regular meeting times. And I've had one family, the 9-sibling family. 8 of them lived in the same city as this person. But what they did is once they understand their roles and they understood what mom needed, they did a monthly dinner, and they met at a restaurant, and each sibling took a turn actually reminding them when the day was and the time and picking the restaurant each month. So then, they kind of would even rotate that role. So they would come together, and if they could make it, great. If they didn't, then there was an email follow-up. But they came together for an hour once a month and just had dinner, talked through everything, made sure everybody was okay, and that's how they made it work. So just even once you've got the plan in place, encouraging families for regular check-in points. I think that dinner actually it's a social time with your siblings, and it actually just gives them that reconnection point with each other. So it's just a great, great idea that this wonderful family that I worked with used. Now, think about the long-distance caregivers. When we're dividing the workload, there's lots of things that they can do to help as well. They can place online orders. They could be doing the bill paying because that can be done electronically. They could be appointment scheduling. So there's a lot. They could be, making phone calls. They could send letters and emails. They could be doing lots of things. So we got to remind the primary caregivers or the caregivers that live in the same city that there are jobs for that long-distance caregiver. I think sometimes it's easy to overlook and just say, well, you're not here, but there are things that we can have them do. I go back to my mom and my aunt. There were lots of things that my mom could do from 45 miles away for the care situation. Now, I can't say it enough that communication is the key, and I know we talk a lot about that on all of these webinars, but on the next slide, I want to just look at communication again as a focus when we're working with families. Time spent understanding the situation from each person's perspective, again, so important. When siblings learn each other's perspectives, things will run smoother. Also, this is one that's sometimes overlooked. Encourage siblings to spend time with the care recipient, with their mom or dad, and talk to them in person. Sometimes siblings need to see it with their own eyes, what's actually happening. Again, this goes back to maybe a long-distance situation, but it's really important to encourage each sibling to take some time and really visit and understand with the senior loved one, what is happening, what are their needs. This might even involve visiting with their doctor or other healthcare professionals. So again, the key is to not jump to conclusions and always seek understanding. So before siblings question anything or bring up touchy topics, it's really just important for them to seek understanding. And even when you practice that mentality of curiosity or seeking understanding, it goes a long way with that primary caregiver too. We've talked about communication and how often, again, over-communicating is okay. It's important. It's important that everybody even understands the same messages. So that's why communicating is so important. And I think back to, again, one of my family situations when my grandmother was admitted to hospice. I'll never forget that the nurse practitioner was in front of our whole family telling us why, that she came to this conclusion, why hospice was necessary. And, of course, we were all stunned a little bit. And then she left the room, and we kind of all started to talk about it. And what we realized is we all heard something completely different. Now, my first reaction was, no, what I heard was right. And, of course, that was everybody else's reaction. And a couple of us actually wanted to get up and sort of leave the room and be done with it because we just couldn't believe that they had heard something different. And so we really just stopped. Nobody left the room, and we really just tried to understand each other's concerns and each other's why or why not we didn't think that that was a good decision, or why not we disagreed with the diagnosis. And by doing that, we just really we all came to the same conclusion and actually ended up all in tears at the end saying we just don't want her to die. We just didn't want this to be the end, So that's where it was all coming from. And once we all understood that, it just led to a lot healthier conversation. Now, of course, the nurse came back in too and had another conversation with us, so we all heard the same thing. But I'm just trying to illustrate that over-communicating is especially a good tip with long-distance caregivers. And it's not just the primary caregiver's job to send out information. The siblings should be calling in on a regular basis as well. And this, again, is where empathy can come into play. As siblings react to each other and to the situation, really trying to put themselves into the different roles and understand perspectives. That's why I wanted you all to sort of visualize either a family that you've worked with or with your own family and how this would go. Really sort of trying to understand where the other sibling is coming from. I say it on every webinar when we talk about communication, body language, voice tone, posture, all of those things so important, especially in a touchy situation like that. And, of course, being honest. This could go back to the primary caregiver. If the load is too much, they must communicate and get help. Being honest with each other about, if you disagree with something, it's okay to be honest and say that you disagree with the decision. It's just, again, the approach and how you disagree, and that goes back to, the voice tone and maybe being curious, like help me understand is a word that might, or phrase that might work in these kind of situations. So, of course, honesty is always one of the best policies. Now, let's look at the resources on the next slide that we have to help you all navigate this situation. So at the core of the 50-50 rule is a family relationship and a communication guide. It's on a website called solvingfamilyconflict.com. This is where this is a great place to send the family caregivers and the siblings because there's practical advice. There's a lot of real-life scenarios. There's expert responses. There's also the actual booklets and the checklists are available there. So that solvingfamilyconflict.com is a great resource for family caregivers. There's also organizations and resources available to help the family caregiver learn about their options. Now, you can encourage family members to do research and to reach out so that everybody has the opportunity to understand what's out there. There's a couple of sites, eldercare.gov or caring.com. I also think all of you in your jobs every day, you are a wealth of information and knowledge. You're the one who has the resources and the information about the agencies on aging or geriatric care managers. All of you just have so much information. So this is where you all can really help families by just sharing the knowledge that you have in the community. Now, taking care of aging family members it's a really tough job. We've talked about this all year, and the stakes are high, and the sibling relationships and the quality of the senior's care are at risk. So with these new thoughts and new approaches, and when we focus on building better family relationships, caregiving can make families stronger than ever, and that, of course, is our goal. So let's look on the last slide, some next steps. I hope that you found it very helpful today and encouraging. We've gone over a lot of information again today. I think a lot of you are working, like I said, with these clients and with families already or having some of those issues. And I know a lot of you are faced or you're put in the middle of these issues all the time. So just think about, kind of make some notes or some action steps now about what are some of those hot buttons, what are some of the resources that you have available that you can help family caregivers and siblings kind of navigate this world. How are you going to incorporate what you learned today into your arsenal of resources, so to speak? And really just think about how you can promote this great relationship between siblings by having the information and knowing how to sort of navigate this. Hopefully helps you guys get out of the middle of it a little bit and really helps you to maintain that objective way of handling this. And so hopefully you've got some good tips today on that was my goal, for you guys to get some tips so that you're not in the middle of it all the time. It's so hard. I've been in the middle of it so many times. I definitely understand. So thank you all so much for joining today. Again, I wish you just a wonderful holiday season. And I really thank you all for the work you're doing every day to help seniors and families. You're doing such a fantastic job, and it's very much appreciated. Take care, all of you. And on that note, Steve, I would like to turn it back over to you and open up for questions.
All right. Thanks very much, Molly. Fantastic presentation, as always. And, yes, it is time for the Q&A portion here. During the Q&A portion, we also want to welcome Erin Albers from Home Instead Senior Care to the Q&A section of today's webinar. So welcome, Erin.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, first question here, and this is, I think, a really important one, Molly. You were talking about kind of being the professional in the middle. And so the question is, can you talk more about what to do when siblings are attempting to triangulate you into taking sides?
That is a great question, and I really think that the answer is more of, again, trying to drive them to resources. But I guess I'm picturing a situation where this definitely happened to me. What I always tried to do, because I'll tell you guys, I've had this happen to me before a few times where I did take a side. And the outcome was disaster because the other two siblings in this case, came up to me and said, I thought you thought what we wanted to do was the right thing to do. Why did you tell, my sibling that really was the deal? And it just I felt like, oh my gosh, I felt like I sort of violated a code that I forgot about or something. It sort of felt like, I pictured my own family, and I felt like, oh my gosh, I just turned on one of my siblings, so to speak. I sort of got in that mode. And so from that point on, because of course in that situation I'm definitely apologizing. I'm very sorry. And I actually ended up calling all three of them in the room and let's hash it out. But in moving forward, what I learned from that situation was I constantly brought up the other siblings' names or ideas or thoughts. So when a sibling presented me with a situation where this is what I think is right and this is what I want to do, I would say, well, what does Susie and Sally think about this? I've heard Susie and Sally say this, whatever the situation is. So from that point on, and I definitely use names, and I definitely would say, well, Susie called me yesterday, and this is what her concern was. And so a lot of times I offered to have everybody come together, and I know it's scary because you're sort of putting yourself in the middle, but at the same time, once they all got in the room, they sort of hashed it out. 9 times out of 10, they would sort of hash it out. And yes, they'd look to me to say something, and I would say, well, you're all right. You have to decide what the best route is. So it's really hard. It takes a lot of practice. There's no silver bullet, I guess, so to speak, or I don't have the exact solution that you should use, but just trying to, again, it's so hard, but staying impartial and really reflecting or reminding the person who's trying to get you to take their side and make a decision, trying to get them to say, I understand your point, but I've heard Sally say something different, so let's talk to Sally as well before we make a decision. I mean, you just sort of got to take that road. I hope that's helpful, just by using my own terrible scenario where I definitely got caught a few times in that circle.
Okay, next question for you here, and this is another great one too. The question is, how can a sibling who is a primary caregiver bring up sharing responsibility with other siblings, particularly if the other siblings are not as close physically and or emotionally to the parent and the caregiving sibling? Tough question.
That is a tough question, and it's hard. It's hard because I think the primary caregiver sometimes doesn't want to admit they need help, and so that's hard. It's hard to even reach out and say, I need help, I need support. So the fact that somebody wants to reach out is huge. I think it definitely warrants a conversation where we've got to encourage that family caregiver to at least have a one conversation with the person. I've had those families where there's a sibling that does not want to be involved at all or is not involved at all. But what we always encourage those families to do was to at least reach out at least one time and say, here's what's going on with Mom. Boy, I could use your help. If you can't do that, that's okay. Here's what I'm going to do, though. There's just something about it's doing the right thing and still involving, even if the person is not going to be in the picture or is not nearby. I think everybody would sleep better at night just knowing that you at least made the attempt to try. And it may not always work where they're going to get somebody to help, but you've got to reach out and try. I know that's, again, it's so hard because it's easier said than done. I think that if we can help the primary caregiver, again, come up with the list of needs or the list of concerns and even sort of having it down on paper so when they are making that phone call or they are meeting in person, they can stick right to, here's what's happening, here's what I need help with. So it's, again, just preparing them for the conversation and preparing them for the answer either way. And I know a lot of you must do this on a regular basis too, is to really help that situation.
Okay, next question. How do you engage all of the siblings when there's a strong leader who does all the talking without making that self-appointed leader mad?
Another great question, and that I go back to my family of 9. That was definitely the case, and I remember my first meeting with them. First of all, finding a big enough space for 8 of them because the one didn't live in town. We did end up calling that person though, but I basically said I sort of set it up as my process was to hear from everybody. And it was a sort of a role where I was trying to help them figure out the best options for their mom. And I was sort of sitting there, and I would say, I've heard a lot from you, Dan, and this is great information, but I would like to hear from the other siblings too. And so I just sort of looked at it as my role to involve everybody, and I set it up with the primary caregiver as, this is a family meeting. I need to hear from everybody when we're moving through this. So I just I made it about me and not about they're dominating and we need other people to talk. I turned it around and made it about, this is the process. So I just sort of tried to delicately say, and sometimes I would say to Dan, the primary guy or one of the primary guys, it was funny because he was a primary talker and he knew it, but the daughter, one of his siblings, his sisters, was the primary caregiver. But anyway, I would say to Dan, I would say, you've got a lot of great ideas. I would definitely compliment him and say, I know I can see that you have a vision, but I want to know what Susie's and Sally's vision is as well. So I guess I just, I tried to go around it without offending him by saying my process is to hear what the entire family wants. And then that included visiting with the aging mother that they were working, that they were caring for. So it wasn't I just made it about the process and not about the dominant person. I hope that helps.
Yeah, definitely. Next question here. What about a situation where the patient's spouse is still alive, but they don't want to be the responsible party for making decisions and defer to one of the children?
So I guess the question was, Steve, will you read it one more time? I'm trying to understand what the means.
Yeah, how about a situation where a client's spouse is still alive, but the spouse does not want to be the responsible party for making decisions, and they are deferring to one of their children? Well,
I think, again, the children have to be on the same page. I think I would take the same approaches that we've talked about today, where the children, if there's more than one, again, that's where you can appoint the child that he wants to be the primary decision maker as the power of attorney. But again, I think it still matters that you have siblings involved. And it looks like Dad's maybe playing favorites if that's the angle we're going with, where I want this person to make the decisions. I still think everything we've talked about today, you could still foster that kind of teamwork mentality or teamwork, even involving the spouse as well still. We still want to involve Dad in the situation and the decisions, but in the end, he just feels like this child can probably make the final call. I still think that I've seen this happen before too. Now that we're talking about this example, where Dad does say, no, this person's going to be the one. And some other siblings, that goes back to the old age rivalry. It's always been there. They know that that's the sibling that Dad was going to pick. So a lot of times that isn't an issue, but if it is, it's, again, really having a conversation with Dad and that primary caregiver initially saying, you've got to still keep everybody involved to keep the peace in the family or to keep harmony. You'll ultimately make the decisions in the end, but you've got to help. You've got to get everybody else's input. So hopefully even just by having the conversation and maybe even illustrating some examples that all of you faced where if you don't involve everybody, what could happen? I didn't go there with a lot of those stories today because it's so sad, but we all know families that have been ruined over this type of a situation, over a caregiving situation where siblings disagree. I've seen it happen a few times, and it's terrible. So, again, just reiterating to the primary person that Dad is choosing with the rest of the family that these are his wishes, but that they're going to stay as a unit. He's just going to be the one to sign the papers and to, officially put the word in, so to speak. So, again, even just because you're appointed the primary, maybe, again, use that word coordinator instead of primary. If just the way you talk about it makes a big difference.
Okay, Molly. Well, we have reached the end of our hour, and we are just about out of time for today's webinar, but I want to thank you for another fantastic presentation, and thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you all today.